Hello everybody, and welcome to a Ravnica Allegiance Guild Guide. Today we are going to be talking about Simic, the blue-green guild. But before I begin, I do have a couple of things to get out of the way. First of all, I have opted to do a guild-by-guild guide rather than a full set review, card by card, because in a set that has guilds, you are so heavily incentivized to play the guilds because of the gold cards that the cards you are playing with are so often framed in the guilds that it is more useful to talk about them in those frames. Another thing I do want to say is that I'm not going to be giving cards grades because they fluctuate so heavily, but I will talk about which cards you need to prioritize and when, and roughly how early you should pick the card if that is relevant. Another thing I want to say is, if you do enjoy this video and want to see more guild guides, be sure to hit that thumbs up. If this video gets to 50 thumbs up, I guarantee I will make another guild guide. Leave in the comments section down below which guild you want to see next. Also, if you have any questions about cards that I'm going to be talking about, or any cards you just want me to talk about in general that I don't mention, be sure to leave that in the comments section down below as well. I really do love talking about cards and helping everybody get better along the way. But without further ado, let's jump into the guide. First of all, we are going to be talking about what Simic wants to be doing, how to draft Simic, though in sealed, many of the same things will apply, like which cards you want to put in your deck, and then we're going to be talking about the key cards and synergies in Simic. First of all, we need to look at what Simic wants to be doing, the mission statement. What Simic wants to be doing in Ravnica Allegiance is it wants to stall the game and then win with instant speed trickery and mana sinks. And what I mean by instant speed trickery is you pass the turn with all of your mana up, representing either adapting your creatures or you have an instance in your hand that you can potentially get your opponent with because they're not ready for the specific instant you have. So for example, if on turn 4 I play a Skitter Eel, and then I pass on turn 5 without doing anything, I can be representing adapt the Skitter Eel, or I could be representing a counterspell or a combat trick or any number of other instant speed spells. So you want to make sure you have a diverse range of instants so that you can be representing them and trick your opponent, especially in games 2 and 3, where maybe they saw the applied Biomancy that you played, which is a bounce spell, but they didn't see your counterspell. So they play around the bounce spell, get wrecked by the counter, or you just adapt your creature end of turn and don't waste your mana. That's the beauty of adapt, is you can use it at instant speed, and totally get advantages because that it is an instant speed spell. Same thing with a Sorrowform Hybrid. You can represent, if say I had a Sorrowform Hybrid and I had a Skitter Eel on the battlefield, I could represent either maybe adapting the Sorrowform Hybrid, or I could use Skitter Eel plus another instant spell. So Simic really wants to stall the game so it can make use of adapt, because adapt is often quite expensive, and it doesn't impact the board a super high amount. Because you're still only going to have one creature. But if you use it with instant speed interaction, it can be quite devastating. Drafting Simic, the things you want to prioritize are early plays. The early plays for Simic are really important because you oftentimes are going to be able to win the late game very easily, due to the fact that many of your creatures are going to have mana sinks built into them. That makes it very easy to win late game against decks that don't have every creature with a ability to add extra counters to itself and stay relevant. So your 2-drop is going to become a 6/6 later, but their 2-drop is going to stay a 2-drop. So you want to just make sure that you don't die and get run over early, because you are going to be pretty well set up in the late game. Another thing you want to keep in mind when drafting Simic is you want to take a mix of instant speed effects. I already talked about diversity a little bit, but if you have a counterspell and already you want to take bounce spells slightly higher than your next counterspell, because you want to keep that mix so your opponent doesn't know exactly what you have. If you have 5 bounce spells and you have up 4 mana, your opponent knows it's going to be a bounce spell. But if you have 2 counters, 2 bounce spells, and an instant speed removal effect, your opponent really doesn't know what's going to hit them. It makes it really hard to play around, and you can oftentimes get more value from your spells. And then, as I said already, remember, you win the late game in most matchups. So unless your opponent has shown you that they have a great late game, Simic is going to have one of the best late games in the format. So you are going to be well set up. That is going to make Simic a pretty nice choice for pre-releases, because in sealed, the games are going to go slower naturally, because you oftentimes cannot get the cards you need for aggressive starts. So the games are going to stall out, and Simic is going to be advantaged in sealed. So I think it's going to be a good guild for your pre-release if you like Simic. The top commons for Simic. I think Sorrowform Hybrid, I've already mentioned it. I think it is probably the best common for Simic. It's a single colored card, so it can also work in Gruul. And I think that because of that, it's going to be a very high pick for both decks because it's a good card in both archetypes. You want 2-drops for your aggressive Gruul decks. I haven't talked about Gruul obviously yet. I haven't made that guide, but you are going to be wanting to beat down with that deck. It's a red-green deck that is relatively aggressive, so 2-drops are always key, but it's also really important for Simic because it can block on turn 2, so you don't fall too far behind, but it's also just exactly what you want to be doing later. You can hold up the 6 mana, represent multiple different creatures with abilities, representing your instant speed interaction, so I think Sorrowform Hybrid is going to be a very high pick in this format. Next, I have Slimebind as the number 2 common. I think there isn't a ton of hard removal in Simic, and you don't really need hard removal because your creatures are going to be able to eventually just get bigger than the creature that you've slime binded. So it doesn't really matter that they're going to have an extra chump blocker because you're going to be winning the late game with a bunch of creatures that are much bigger than the blocker. So it is going to become a chump blocker and it's not going to be able to stall you out as much. If you were an aggressive deck that was trying to get through with 2/2s, leaving them behind with an 0/3, if you're using Slimebind on their 3/3 or something like that, would be a bit problematic, but in Simic that doesn't really matter. So I think Slimebind is going to be a high pick, especially because it can also be used in other blue decks. I think that the flexibility of being usable in multiple decks is pretty important. Next up, I have Applied Biomancy. It's just a bit tricky to play around. I think that you're not going to want to take too many copies. I think 2 copies is probably going to be the max, just because it is relatively low impact, but it has a couple of diverse effects, so it is a nice card to hold up when you're representing Adapt. Also, you can sometimes adapt and use Applied Biomancy because it is quite cheap. That being said, I don't think it is a super high pickup, and I think that it's definitely pretty close with the next card on the list, Aeromunculus. I think that if you already have an Applied Biomancy, you probably want to take your first Aeromunculus before it. It's also very draft dependent, deck dependent, which one you would rather have. So I think they're very, very close. So I don't think that I would fault you for taking Aeromunculus over Applied Biomancy. I just think you want to make sure that you have a good mix of things to be spending your mana on at instant speed. Aeromunculus, quite strong. 3 mana, 2/3 flyer is already a solid effect, and then being able to make it into a 3/4. 3/4s can really tangle with a lot of other air creatures. They're oftentimes the biggest creature in the air and can block things on the ground relatively effectively. And then the final card that I wanted to highlight is Steeple Creeper. I think Steeple Creeper is the type of card that you do not really need to prioritize, but you'll end up with them if you want them, because they're not really that great outside of Simic. There are some synergies in this set for having creatures with 4 or more power. So there is a 2-drop that gets +1/+1 when you play a creature with 4 power. So there are certain decks that will want Steeple Creeper, but it's not the most powerful thing you can be doing, so you can probably get them a little bit later than the other cards on this list. But it is still going to be quite a nice card in Simic. It's got a little bit of... it doesn't work perfectly with the other Simic cards because you have to be spending the mana on your turn to give it flying, but it's still effective enough as a late game win condition. Just pay 4, give it flying, pay 4, give it flying. That is 8 damage. You can just it just really adds up quite quickly because 4 power is quite a bit. That even though it doesn't work perfectly with Adapt because you're not able to really giving flying on their turn doesn't really matter as much. It's still going to be an effective card, so I think it's going to be a card you want to prioritize. Other cards that almost made the top commons list but didn't, there's a counter spell at common. So I think having 1 copy of that in your Simic decks is going to be quite nice just because, as I said, you're going to be holding up mana a lot of the time, and counter spells are really nice for that type of situation because you're not going to be wasting your mana if you don't counter something. Okie doke. Next up we have Simic All Stars. These are the cards that make you want to play Simic, in my opinion, and they're the type of cards that you will take very early in the draft. For example, I think Frilled Mystic is going to be a very first pickable card. Frilled Mystic being the 2 green, 2 blue card that really you can only play in Simic, but it is worth it. It's a functional reprint of Mystic Snake, just harder to cast and it's bigger. 4 mana, 3/2 flash isn't insane stats, but the fact that you counter a spell is really huge because there's a lot of times where you can just hold up 4 mana. Your opponent thinks, oh, he's just going to adapt his creature. He tries to cast his spell, you Frilled Mystic it, you just go so far ahead on tempo that you basically can't lose. Gyre Engineer is great. Simic really does enjoy ramp. A lot of the times, ramping from 3 mana to 5 mana or 3 mana to 6 mana wouldn't be insane, but Gyre Engineer is going to be great because you are going to have a lot of things to spend your mana on. So much so that I think that in many Simic decks, you're going to want to run 18 lands just so that you can make sure that you don't get stuck early. Trollbred Guardian is another Simic card that I think is quite effective. It makes it hard for your opponent to stall you out with a bunch of small tokens. This could particularly be a problem against Orzhov, where they'll have creatures that die and make 1/1s. But if you have a Trollbred Guardian, all of your creatures have trample, so it's really hard for other decks to just chump you endlessly. And it is by itself quite an effective creature. 5 mana 5/5 is already pretty scary, and then when you can give it +2/+2 and trample essentially for 3 mana permanently buffed, yeah, that's really effective. So I think Trollbred Guardian is also going to be a very early pick. And then, once again, Sorrowform Hybrid. I just want to keep highlighting the fact that this card is great. I think you should take it early and play it often. Okie doke. These are the cards that I think are a little bit traps for Simic. I really want to go over them, especially before your pre-release, so you don't get tricked into playing these or playing them incorrectly. So first of all, I want to say Wilderness Reclamation. I don't think it's very effective. I just think that there is the natural thought process, okay, I'll play Wilderness Reclamation. On my turn, I'll cast a spell, then I'll untap, and then I'll adapt my guys. I just don't think it's going to work out that way. You are going down a card to play Wilderness Reclamation, and so I do not think it's going to be effective enough to justify the cost, especially because if you end up having a mulligan or something like that, you're oftentimes not going to have the card density needed to use Wilderness Reclamation effectively. So I think you should just not play Wilderness Reclamation. In a similar vein, Growth Spiral is a card that is a bit more niche, I think, than people would realize. When you see draw a card on an instant, you're like, oh, it replaces itself. But it really doesn't do what Simic is trying to achieve in the early game. Simic doesn't necessarily want to just ramp and play a big fatty. Simic's strength comes from the fact that it can play a relatively medium-sized creature and then grow it at instant speed on the opponent's turn. So you don't necessarily need to just get your lands out as fast as possible. You want to be making sure you're impacting the board on the early turns and making sure you don't just die to the opponent's onslaught if they're playing an aggressive deck. So I don't think Growth Spiral is going to be particularly good. I think you can definitely play it in certain builds, preferably with 18 lands, so you can make sure you hit like the extra land effect on it multiple times. You really only want to be playing it if you are a deck that wants 18 lands, because you want to be getting your mana out every turn and consistently. So I don't really necessarily think it's a great card. Oftentimes it's just going to be a cantrip for 2 mana, and that doesn't really do enough. Combine Guildmage is a card that I do not think is bad. Don't get me wrong. I think Combine Guildmage is definitely a card that is pretty good in Simic. I don't think it's insane. It is a 2 mana 2/2, and the effects are a little bit tricky to understand and use properly. The reason I put it in the traps category is because the first ability, the 1 and a green tap, this turn, each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. I think that this is a bit of a trap ability because the way Adapt works is that the creature only gets to adapt if it has no +1/+1 counters on it. So if you use Combine Guildmage to put a +1/+1 counter on your creatures, then you don't get to adapt them. So a lot of the time, your creature could maybe adapt for like four and get like 4 counters, but because you use your Combine Guildmage, it only gets 1 counter. So that is something to keep in mind for sure when you're using Combine Guildmage. I think the ability to move counters is quite nice because you can move the counters to something else, maybe itself, and then you can adapt again. So Combine Guildmage is a good card. Just don't get trapped by the first ability. I know it's going to happen to someone. They're going to try to adapt with a creature that has a counter on it already, and it's going to end badly and be quite sad. So don't be that person. The last trap, I think, is Scuttlegator. I really love that there is a crab, turtle, crocodile in this set, but I think it is a little bit of a trap because, again, I do not think it's doing what Simic necessarily wants to be doing. I don't think it's unplayable. Don't get me wrong. I think it's going to be much better in Sealed than in Draft. But the problem with Scuttlegator is that when you play it, you can't immediately attack them, and that's not the hugest problem. But it doesn't do exactly it doesn't really do what Simic's trying to do, which is play medium-sized creatures and then make them big. This creature's already big, and then you're making it even bigger. So it's not going to be as effective in the strategy where you're trying to play your like 4-drop and then on turns 5 and 6 just hold up mana so you can cast your instants and adapt your creatures and things like that. That's not to say that Simic can't play sorcery speed creatures. There are quite a few good sorcery speed creatures in the set. Especially the ones that have Riot, so they can be like 5 mana 4/4 hasters or 5/5. So there's a lot of pretty good vanilla creatures or non like adapt creatures. But I think Scuttlegator is just going to hit the wayside a little bit more than be played, and I think that people are going to play it a little bit more just because it does look terrifying as a crab, turtle, crocodile. this is just the little bit of a sum up thing at the end. Things to remember about Simic: you can adapt at instant speed. That is the whole crux of Simic, I think, is that you want to adapt your creatures at instant speed and represent the instants that you also have in your deck. You can only adapt once. I know that that's probably pretty obvious to most people, but keep that in mind. Don't start like thinking, okay, I'm going to adapt this creature this turn, and the next turn I'll adapt it again. You can only adapt once, especially just remember that for your pre-release, or if your opponent has a adapt creature that looks particularly scary, you can be like, okay, they can only adapt it once, and then I'll deal with it later. And then finally, try to diversify your instants. I've said it multiple times. I think repetition really helps it come home, is make sure that your opponent can't just play around one type of spell, like a bounce spell. Diversifying your instants is going to be really effective in Simic. Okie doke. How do you beat Simic? I mean, at the end of the guide, it's obviously the best thing to do is talk about the weaknesses of the deck. So I think the best way to beat Simic, first of all, you can apply early pressure. This is probably going to be what Rakdos does to beat Simic. If you put early pressure on them, then they'll have to trade with their adapt creatures. And when they trade with their adapt creatures, they lose a lot of the value that they are gaining. It makes it very tricky for them to then hold up instants later on in the game. Another thing you can do with Simic is you can use your own instant speed interaction to really punish them. So they tap 6 mana to put 4 counters on their guy, and then you kill it at instant speed. That's going to be really effective. I think bounce spells are going to be pretty good against Simic because, again, they're spending a lot of mana to put counters on their creature, and then you bounce their creature, really put them behind on mana. And then I think Simic is going to have some trouble beating bomb rares. They don't really have the hard removal that they need to deal with bomb rares, so they're oftentimes going to have to use a counter spell, and if they don't have a counter spell, they are going to struggle. Anyway, that is going to do it for my guide on how to play and draft Simic. I hope you enjoyed it. As I said at the beginning, remember to hit that thumbs up and subscribe to get updates for whenever I post a new video in this series. And let me know in the comment section if you have any questions and which guild you want to see next. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.